Hey there YouTube. I'm going to try something a little bit different for this week's video. Now, some people like to go out drinking, others like to collect stamps. One of the things I like to do is read the internet for information about what goes wrong with different makes and models of cars. Now, I've had a fair bit of time on my hands over the last year or so and spent quite a bit of time researching what car I was going to buy next, and I came up with quite a few options in several price categories and in different sizes and classes of car, if you want to call it that. So what I've thought I've done is actually put a video together with my recommendations about what you would buy from a pretty cheap car up to a reasonably priced one in every major category. What I like to look for is different makes and models of cars which are as free from major problems as possible and tend not to suffer from recurring problems. Now, as I go through the list of cars, I will say for each model on the list what is the worst thing you need to look out for when going to buy one of these cars. Now, I do recommend that you research this more thoroughly and don't just take my word for things. Go out there and consult as many sources as you can. It's not my intention to badmouth anyone here, and to some of you out there, this may sound like almost like a blacklist of cars coming out, but do remember that these are by far the better ones out there, at least in my opinion. So before we move on to my list of recommendations, there's just a couple of things to think about, most important of which is your budget. Now, I do encourage you to think about what you can genuinely afford to spend on the car. I wouldn't advise you literally spend all the money you have on a car, because pretty much anything in this price category is likely to have some faults lurking somewhere, unfortunately. So rather than say spend the entire 3,000 that you could afford to spend on a car, I would encourage you to say look for a car around the £2,000 mark and have 1,000 in reserve for as a contingency for basically whatever you find wrong with it over the first few weeks. Now, with that said, the other major thing which seems to spark a lot of debate when looking for a car is the petrol versus diesel argument. Now, without going on to the whole diesel emission side of that argument, what I will say is petrol is generally the most reliable option. When you compare a modern petrol engine to a modern diesel engine, petrol hasn't really moved on an enormous amount over the last 10-20 years, whereas diesel technology has come on leaps and bounds and is a hell of a lot more complicated than it used to be. There are three basic types of diesel injection floating around out there. The first is your traditional rotary injection pump diesels. They're getting very thin on the ground now, but there are a few out there that I believe are still worth having and can still be found in reasonable numbers. They're generally pretty reliable, and the injection technology will, generally speaking, last the service life of the car without having any major headaches. The second type that's floating around there is what's called unit injectors. An example of this is the Volkswagen PD system. These are generally pretty reliable, but as for the example that I've named there, you have to be very careful that the car has been maintained properly, as it needs a special oil in order to lubricate the injectors properly. So you've got to be careful what you're buying, but if you get a good one, again, they're very reliable. The third type of diesel injection that's out there is common rail injection. That basically covers everything built in about the last 10 years. Now, although it's cleaner, it's quieter, more efficient, it, to my mind, it's inherent in the design of these systems that they are going to suffer very expensive problems within their service life. So basically, by the time you get down into this price category, just to put it simply, to my mind, a common rail diesel is simply not worth bothering with, because the potential headaches will easily outweigh the savings on fuel. So there will not be a single common rail diesel anywhere on this list, and my advice is just stay clear of them. The potential expense is simply not worth the fuel savings, and you can get some petrol engines that, you know, come close on efficiency levels, so not worth it. I'd stay away. Another thing to consider is there's a manual versus automatic transmission. Generally speaking, manual is the simplest and most reliable, and it is by far the most popular here in the UK. Some people prefer automatics, myself included, and obviously there are people out there that will need to drive an automatic. Can be a bit of a minefield trying to buy a good cheap used automatic, and you know there are a lot of sort of semi-automatics or automated manuals. They can be very troublesome if you get the wrong one, so there's not going to always be an automatic recommendation on here. I've tried as much as possible to fit them in, but I'm only going to put an automatic recommendation in where there is a good automatic that has a proven track record. So with that said, let's move on to the list. Okay, we'll start with the £1,000 price category. For a city car, first recommendation I have is actually a trio of cars that goes right across the price categories. It's the Toyota Aygo, Citroen C1 and Peugeot 107. They're all built together in the same factory and all share the same 3-cylinder 1-litre Toyota petrol engine and a conventional manual gearbox. That's the recommendation there. Not a lot goes wrong with the cars, pretty simple by today's standards. And generally considered to be very reliable. Now in this price category, if you are after a city car with a diesel engine, assuming you can even find one of these for sale, I could also recommend the VW Lupo and the Seat Arosa with the 1.7 litre SDI engine. Moving on to a conventional small car, Skoda Fabia or Volkswagen Polo with the 1.9 litre SDI engine is very good. Biggest things to look out for there are problems with the ABS and problems with the electronic power steering. If you go to look at one of the cars for sale and you see either of those lights on, just walk away. Other than that, just general used car checks. Next, we've got the Mark 1 Toyota Yaris. That's best with the 1 litre or the 1.3 litre petrol engines. Both manual and automatic are very good. The 1.3 is probably the engine of choice. I'd only go for the 1 litre if it has insurance implications. Biggest thing to really watch out for on those is rust, particularly around the sills and the rear suspension. I'd check the MOT history for any advisories on rust, and if you see that recurring for several years, I'd go look for another car. With that said though, the Yaris is mechanically excellent, with basically nothing to report at all. Another recommendation in this category is the Vauxhall Corsa C with the 1.7 DI or DTI engine. Again, that's a traditional rotary pump engine. Things to watch out for with that model are electronic power steering problems and difficulty in getting the diesel engine to start. That can be caused by either bad solder joints in the ECU that controls the diesel pump, or by poor valve clearances, which can be adjusted by putting shims in place. Perhaps that's a car that's better left to people that are DIY inclined at this point, because it could get a bit pricey to deal with at a garage. It is still a very good small car, and that is an excellent diesel engine. Okay, moving on to the medium car category, the first recommendation I have is the E11 Toyota Corolla. This is best with the older engine options. That's the 1.3 litre 4E FE, 1.6 full AFE, and the old 1.9 litre non-turbocharged diesel. Biggest problem to look out for on the Corolla again, and this really applies to any car in this price category, is rust. Not so much what you can see, but rust underneath. Again, the MOT history is a very good place to start looking for that, as well as what you can see just by looking underneath from around the outside of the car. Problem you'll run into there is actually tracking down one of those cars now, because most of those engines, I believe, went out of production by about model year 2001, and at that point they were replaced by the VVTi engines, which unfortunately have a bit of a reputation for developing oil sludge around the piston rings, and that results in often very high oil consumption. It's not guaranteed to happen by any means, but the problem is when you're looking at a used car to buy, you really don't know whether it's going to have that problem or not, until several weeks beyond the point of purchase. So unless you can buy one of those cars from someone who you can get an honest answer off as to if it's consuming oil, I simply wouldn't buy one. Next recommendation I've got is the Vauxhall Astra G. The Astra's, generally speaking, very good at resisting rust. About the only place you'll find any of any significance is in the front subframe, and if the worst did come to the worst, that's a replaceable part anyway. It just bolts on and bolts off. You can get them used quite reasonably priced, and a garage shouldn't charge the earth to have that fitted. Engine wise, the sweet spot's basically 1.6 petrol. Manual and automatic are both good there. There are a couple of diesel engines available that are both quite good, but do have a couple of problems which perhaps again relegates them into the territory for only somebody that's DIY inclined. 1.7 DTI has the same warnings I gave about the Corsa. The 2 litre DTI, first is electrical faults within the ECU for the diesel pump, and that can be taken off and repaired, put back in place. The other thing that can happen with these engines is that they develop air leaks on the diesel pipes and the injector seals. That causes the diesel to drain back to the tank. You then get problems starting, and if you run the pump without diesel in it for too long, you'll destroy it. So again, I think I would recommend the diesels there are best left to owners that are more DIY inclined, because there could be some expensive problems to get sorted out at a garage. Next recommendation I have is the Golf Mark IV. It's probably best with the 1.9 litre SDI engine. That's very simple. There's no turbocharger, no dual mass flywheel, none of the stuff you get associated with modern diesels, although you may find it to be a little on the slow side, particularly at town driving speeds, but very solid and reliable. Also the Golf is generally very good at resisting rust. It sometimes gets some minor cosmetic rust around the wheel arches, but nothing to be too worried about. Also a lot of TDI diesels available there. My opinion, you don't really need the extra power in a car of that size. The earlier rotary pump TDIs, that's the 19110 horsepower, very solid and reliable really. You can get turbo trouble and you will eventually have to replace the clutch and dual mass flywheel, but they're not particularly problematic. The later PD diesels come with those same warnings, and also you must make sure that they've been properly maintained using the correct grade of oil, or you can have wear in the camshafts and the injectors. Other thing, just make sure the minor electrical things like the windows and the central locking are working properly. Next recommendation, the Honda Civic Mark 8. I can only recommend the 1.8 litre VTEC petrol with a manual gearbox. Nothing really at all to report on those cars, very solid and reliable. Next up we've got the Ford Focus. Basically Mark 1 and Mark 2 are both recommended in this price category. Try and get a Mark 2 if you can because it's newer. Basically the recommendation is any 4-cylinder petrol with a manual or an automatic, and in the Focus Mark 1 there's also the 1.8 TDDI diesel, which was available I think up to about 2001 or 2002. That is again a traditional rotary pump diesel, no particular problems with it, so it's a pretty solid diesel recommendation, but you're going to have trouble finding one of those at this point. They're very thin on the ground. Next recommendation, a medium car, the Hyundai Accent. 3 variants of the car out there. They're all recommended as a petrol and a manual, and they're all very dependable. The first 2 generations did suffer quite badly with rust, unfortunately, and the 3rd generation seems to only ever come up for sale as a 2-door hatchback, which is perhaps not really what you want in a medium-sized car, but if you can live with lack of rear doors, it's a very solid car, very dependable. Other recommendations have the Nissan Almera with a petrol manual. Just make sure it's running properly, because there have been some reports of stretched timing chains which can cause a lumpy idle and other problems. Very important though to make sure that the oil changes are kept up as with any timing chain engine. Mazda 323 is also recommended in this price category. Biggest problem there by far is rust. The 323 is mechanically an absolutely excellent car. It's just a shame that we live in a climate where so much salt gets used on the road, and it does tend to rust out the typical areas like the sills and so forth. So if you can find one that the rust hasn't gotten into, it'd be well worth having that rust proofed and looking after it, because they are an absolutely excellent car mechanically. Really nothing at all to report. They do have timing belts which will need replacing, but they are a non-interference engine, so if the belt breaks, sure, you'll be going home on a tow truck, but you won't have actually done any damage to the engine. That only applies to the petrol engines, not to the very rare turbo diesel. There's several different size petrol engines available, all fine from what I know. Manual gearbox and automatic gearbox are both fine. I think the diesel only comes as a manual. Again, I think that's a very good engine, but odds of finding one of those is about nil at this point. Also, should say that comment about non-interference petrol engines, that also applies to the 1.3 and 1.6 litre that I recommend in the Corolla. other thing, just make sure the minor electrical things like the windows and the central locking are working properly. Next recommendation I've got is the Mark 1 Toyota Avensis. Much like the Corolla, I'm only going to recommend some of the earlier engines. You've got the 1.6 4 AFE, 1.87 AFE, 2 litre 3 SFE. Again, the engines that replace those have a tendency to consume oil, so best to stick with these earlier ones. They come in both a manual and automatic, which are both fine. There's also the 2 litre turbo diesel 2 CTE. I believe that only comes with a manual gearbox, but that is incredibly rare to find nowadays. Also very solid engine if you can get hold of one of them. Biggest concern there with the Avensis is probably rust in the sills. They are mechanically excellent. Next recommendation in the large car category, got the Ford Mondeo 1, 2 and 3. They are best really with a 4-cylinder petrol and a manual gearbox. The Mark 1 and 2 are now both pretty rare sights around. There's not many of them for sale. Mark 3 is pretty popular still. With the petrols on the Mark 3, I think for the first couple of years of production, it's important to check that the swirl flaps are okay. If they are working loose, you will hear sort of a rattling noise coming from the engine, but I would think by now most of them will have had the modifications done, and it's unlikely that you're going to come across that problem, but just be aware of it. Okay, if you're after something with 7 seats, a people carrier, got one recommendation in this price category, and that is the Vauxhall Zafira A or Mark 1. The engine of choice there is probably a 1.6. The 1.8 is kind of rare and doesn't really offer a great deal more over the 1.6. Manual transmission and automatic are both pretty good. However, automatics, as a general rule, they tend to get a bit neglected, and compared to the Astra, I think the automatics tend to suffer a bit more in the Zafira, probably to do with the extra weight. So if you're going to buy an automatic, be extra careful that it's working properly when you go to test drive it. The 2 litre DTI is also a pretty good engine, but same warnings apply as in the Astra. Okay, if you're after something with all-wheel drive, I've got 2 recommendations. First is Mark 1 or 2 Honda CR-V. That is best with the 2 litre petrol engine and a manual transmission. Biggest thing to look out for there, particularly on the first generation, is rust. If you can find a second generation which is mechanically okay for this price, that's probably a better option because you'll be getting a newer car. The other recommendation I have is a Toyota RAV4 Mark 1 with 2 litre petrol, and that's good in both an auto and a manual, perhaps actually better in an automatic because there are a few instances of the bearings in the manual transmission giving up there. Okay, moving on to the 2000 price category. In a city car, we've got the one recommendation, which is the Toyota Aygo, Citroen C1, Peugeot 107. Really nothing specific to look out for there. Moving on to a small car, to Yaris Mark II, either with a 1 litre or 1.3 litre petrol engine and a manual transmission. Again, there's nothing in particular to look out for there. If you're looking for an automatic, the best recommendation is still to go for a Mark 1 Toyota Yaris, and it's also, if you find a really nice one, still a good choice if you're after a manual transmission. Another option in the small car category is the Mazda 2, particularly from, I think it's the second generation, starting around 2007. they're best with petrol engine. Manual and automatic are both very good. Worst thing to look out for there is probably ABS problems. Moving on to the medium car category, first recommendation I've got is a Mark 1 Toyota Auris with a 1.6 litre petrol engine and a manual transmission. With that combination, nothing in particular to look out for. If you're after a medium sized car with an automatic gearbox, one to look out for is the Toyota Corolla E12, the very last model year. So we're talking around about something like a 56 or an 07. That was fitted with a 1.6 litre ZRFE petrol engine, which doesn't suffer the oil consumption issues of the earlier models, so that's a very good option in an automatic, pretty good in a manual as well. The next recommendation I've got is a Mark 8 Honda Civic with a 1.8 litre VTEC petrol and a manual gearbox. Nothing particular to look out for there. VW Golf Mark 4 with either 1.9 litre SDI or TDI, just about worth it for this amount of money if you can find a really nice one, but that's going to be pretty difficult to find at this point. Mark 2 Ford Focus with either a 1.6 litre or 2 litre petrol engine. Manual or automatic are both very good. Worst thing to look out for there is probably ABS problems. Mazda 3 with a petrol engine and a manual or automatic gearbox, very good. Again, biggest problem, ABS. Moving on to the large car category, for around £2,000 mark you can get a very nice Kia Magentis or Hyundai Sonata. Best combination there is manual gearbox and the 2 litre petrol engine. You can get a very nice low mileage car for the money there, and there's nothing particular to look out for in that combination. Next recommendation I've got is either a Mark 6 or Mark 7 Honda Accord, petrol and manual. I would personally lean towards a really nice Mark 6 rather than pushing yourself towards a Mark 7. The 7 is generally a very solid car, but it does have a couple of issues that might put you off. Firstly is an above average incidence of failure of the air conditioning. And second is they tend to have a lot of failures around the stereo and the controls of it. That might not sound particularly important, but it is a highly specialised radio to the car, and the controls for the stereo are combined with the controls for the heating and ventilation, so repairs can get pretty expensive. There are some aftermarket kits on sale in the American market which will allow you to replace the standard heating controls and also allow the fitment of like a single or double DIN unit from the aftermarket, but those kits are a couple of £100 plus delivery and import fees, so I might stay away from that. Next recommendation I've got is again Mark 1 Skoda Octavia. Very nice examples, should go for around the £2,000 mark. That the Mark 1 is actually available in limited numbers up to around a 58 plate from what I've seen. If you're going for one that new, I think the only engine available will be the 1.9 PD TDI. Said it before, say it again, just make sure it's been serviced properly and it's running properly, so to take care of the issues regarding camshaft and injector wear. Other than that, just be on the lookout that electrical items are working properly. Now, next couple of recommendations are perhaps best left to DIY enthusiasts. A couple of much older cars than anything else I'm recommending here, and that is a traditional rear wheel drive Volvo. That's the likes of the 240, the 740, 940 and the S&V 90 Classic. They are a very solid car with some incredibly good engineering in them, but given their age now, they are likely to have fairly consistent small problems with them, so if you're not mechanically inclined, it's probably best to stay clear of those. That warning also rings true for the next recommendation, which is a Volvo 850. Again, they are fundamentally a very solid car. In the 850, I would recommend you stay clear of an automatic at this point, because the transmission cooler is really a bit undersized and they tend not to have had the oil changed, so by this point most of them are on borrowed time. But if you get a manual gearbox, very solid and dependable. Now, I've put both of those cars in the £2,000 category because not because you will really go out and spend 2,000 on the car, probably spend around half of that, maybe a little less, but because of the age of those cars, they're probably going to need a fair few problems sorting out. I think that the target budget is around about 2,000 for a nice example of either of those, and you will have yourself a very solid car that'll last a good long time. The rear wheel drive Volvos are best as a 4-cylinder petrol, either manual or automatic. The 850 petrol is fine, diesel is excellent if you can find one, but I would only go for the manual gearbox. Okay, if you're after a 7-seater in this price category, again the recommendation is a Mark 1 Vauxhall Zafira, but at 2,000 you should be looking for a very nice example. 1.6 is still the engine of choice, with a manual gearbox being the best option. 1.8 automatics and the 2-litre diesel are all okay if you heed the warnings about diesel mentioned before. And if you are looking for something with all-wheel drive in this price range, I've got one recommendation, which is going to be the Mark II Honda CR-V, petrol and manual. About the worst thing that you'll come across on the CR-V, they have a above average failure of the air conditioning, which to my mind is really not that big of a deal because we don't live in that warm of a country. Moving into the small car category, first recommendation I've got is still the Mark II Yaris. Only thing to note is that for 3,000 you might just about get the later 1.33 litre petrol engine, which offers better fuel economy, more power and lower tax. If you're after an automatic, Mark 1 Yaris is still a very good option even at this price. They are particularly excellent as an automatic, and the really nice examples will command a high price. Next recommendation I've got is a Dacia Sandero as a 1.2 litre petrol with manual gearbox. I've put that here simply because by today's standards it's an incredibly simple car that's easy to look after, and for the money you'll get a newer car for the price. Final recommendation here is still the 2007 newer Mazda 2 petrol engine, manual or automatic. I think the biggest fault to look out for on those is potential ABS problems. Medium-sized car category remains about the same in this budget. Mark 1 Auris with a 1.6 petrol manual, E12 Corolla with the later 1.6 1ZR FE manual or auto, Civic 8 1.8 petrol, with a manual gearbox. You may also find the 1.4 VTEC coming in around about this price category. Really nothing to say in particular about any of those three recommendations. Also recommended Mark II Focus and the Mazda 3 with 4-cylinder petrol engines, manual or automatic, are both good. Biggest thing to watch out for in either of those two is ABS problems. Moving into the large car category, we've got a couple of new entries, first of which being Lexus IS 250. That comes with a 2.5 litre V6 petrol. You can get that in a manual or an automatic, both of which are good. Only thing particular of note to watch out for there is that the automatics come with an electronic handbrake. It's important to make sure that's working properly. For 3,000, you're just about getting into a Mark III Toyota Avensis, which will come with a 1.8 litre V-Matic petrol engine. Manual and automatic are both fine, however both transmissions come with an electronic handbrake. Just make sure that's working properly. Honda Accord Mark 7 is petrol and manual, also recommended. Just heed 2 warnings about air conditioning in the stereo. If you're after a people carrier in this price category, best recommendation I've got is the Toyota Verso with 1.6 or 1.8 litre V-Matic, manual and automatic gearbox both fine, and in an all-wheel drive Honda CR-V Mark II petrol manual. Okay, moving into the £4,000 price category, city car recommendation remains the same, Aygo C1 107. Moving into the small car category, Mark II Toyota Yaris with a 1 litre or 1.33 litre petrol engine, manual gearbox. Dacia Sandero 1.2 petrol manual, and the 2007 and newer Mazda 2 petrol, either automatic or manual. Just watch for ABS trouble there. Moving to the medium car category, Toyota Auris Mark 1 1.6 manual, Honda Civic Mark 8 with either 1.4 or 1.8 VTEC petrol with a manual gearbox. They are both excellent cars, no particular faults to be aware of. Also highly recommended, we've got the Ford Focus Mark II with 1.6 or 2 litre petrol, manual and automatic, and also Mazda 3 petrol with manual and automatic. Just look out for ABS issues on both of those cars. Moving into the large car category, we've got a new entry, which is the Mark 8 Honda Accord, which in my opinion is an incredibly nice car, and it's unfortunate that that appears to be the last Accord that's going to come to the country, as big car sales have been declining. That is best as a 2 litre petrol with a manual transmission, and there are no particular faults to report there at all. The Lexus IS 250 and the Toyota Avensis Mark III 1.8, both still highly recommended at this price. Just make sure that the electronic handbrake is functioning as it should. Recommendations for a people carrier and an all-wheel drive remain the same. Okay, moving into the final and £5,000 category, recommendation in a city car remains the same. For a small car, the first recommendation is a Mark III Toyota Yaris, which should be achievable at this price. That comes with either a 1 litre or 1.33 litre petrol engine and is available with both manual and automatic gearbox. both of which are fine. Dacia Sandero 1.2 with a manual gearbox, or 2007 and newer Mazda 2 with a petrol engine and manual or auto. Just look for ABS trouble there. Moving into the medium sized car category, not quite going to get a Mark II Toyota Auris for this money, maybe in another year or so. So Mark 1 with a 1.6 litre petrol and a manual gearbox remains recommended, as does the Mark 8 Honda Civic with 1.4 or 1.8 petrol and a manual gearbox. A couple of new entries, and you get the Mark II Hyundai i30 with conventional 1.4 or 1.6 litre petrols and a manual transmission. Don't really know very much about the automatics there. I've no idea whether to recommend them or not. Also, a new entry is the Mark II Kia Ceed, again recommended with a manual gearbox and a conventional 1.4 litre petrol engine. Don't really know anything about the automatics or whether to recommend them or not. Still recommended is the Mazda 3 with a 4-cylinder petrol, manual or automatic, just being mindful of ABS faults. Coming into the large car category, 3 recommendations carry forwards from the £4,000 category, and you also get the Mark II Mazda 6 becomes affordable in this price category. That is best with a 1.8 litre petrol engine and a manual gearbox. Recommendation for an MPV remains the same. Moving into all-wheel drive, Honda CR-V is still recommended, and the 2008 and newer, that's the Mark II Toyota RAV4, becomes available in this price category. That is best with a 2 litre 3ZR FAE petrol engine with either automatic or manual transmission. Okay, congratulations if you've made it this far through, and hopefully you found some useful information here, and more than anything, I hope this video has served to get you thinking about what cars can be very good to own, very reliable, and to help you avoid some of the more problematic vehicles that are out there. Nothing that I have said here is in any way intended to bash any of these manufacturers with the faults that I've mentioned. The vehicles covered in this video are by far the best that money can buy, in my opinion, and suffer from, almost infinitely less faults than some of the vehicles that are out there. I'd also like to add that I have recently purchased one of these vehicles that I've recommended, so if anyone would like to follow along and see how I get on with that car, please consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see what I've purchased in an upcoming video. Thank you very much for watching.